This is the Truth Be Told podcast, where we unlock the secrets of strategic communication. Welcome to this episode of Truth Be Told. Joining me today is Dr. Emily Joseph, a social science researcher with 14 years experience examining human decision-making in a variety of settings. She currently works as a user researcher for Xbox, where she focuses on making games more fun and accessible for all players. Before transitioning to games user research in 2022, Emily worked as an adjunct assistant professor of psychology and criminal justice, where her research focused on lie detection, interrogations, and confessions. Today, we're going to talk about how clear and not so clear communication can affect the type and quality of information elicited from respondents in a variety of settings. The opinions that Emily shares are of her own and do not represent those of Xbox or Microsoft. I'm excited to learn more about this concept, so let's dive right into our conversation. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Truth Be Told. I am your host, Dave Thompson, and I am here with Dr. Emily Joseph. How are you doing today, Emily?
I am doing great and so excited for this. Before we jump into things, I do just want to reiterate that all opinions shared are my own and don't represent those of Xbox or Microsoft. I'll just be talking about my own lived experiences and information that I've gotten from a whole bunch of different twisty-turvy turns that my career has taken me.
Well, that's perfect, and I kind of wanted to start with that because obviously working for Microsoft, which is incredible, but you and I first connected when you were at John Jay. So how did we go from kind of this passion about researching interrogations and false confessions to where you are now?
Actually, if you want to rewind a little further, my story about how I even got to John Jay is interesting. Once upon a time, a catwalk model stumbled off the runway, not literally, into a forensic psychology degree because her parents were wise and decided that she should have a backup plan. And I met research and fell in love with it. Kind of stumbled into a PhD program. Had a scholarship that I was part of that required applying for PhD programs. I was actually planning on going into law enforcement. But I got in because of my research and continued to do research on lie detection, interrogations, and confessions. Started teaching online in 2016, so before COVID, and then really got into kind of the whole design and user experience aspect of online courses. So when COVID hit, I was really prepared for that and conducted some trainings for my fellow faculty members at John Jay. And then after I finished my PhD, I applied for positions both academic, policy related to push criminal justice reform along the lines of what you guys at WZ are doing, along with private government contractors, and then kind of just some straight industry stuff like learning experience design, user experience research, and in researching user experience research, I found out about games user research. And I was like, wait a minute. I can fuse my passion for research and gaming and get paid for it?
Right.
So obviously that's what I decided to go for. And I'm very lucky to have wound up where I am with Xbox Research. I absolutely love the work that I do, where I get to make games more fun and accessible for all players.
Yeah, that's really cool. And when you say user experience, I'll let you expand on that a little bit because my uh, my perspective of that is probably what most people are listening is what type of surveys have I received after I stayed at a hotel, and they want to know what my experience was like, or you use some type of software or video game and you get some type of survey or feedback after, and you got to rank it. Did I like it? Did I not like it? Was it neutral, somewhere in between? And so I know we're gonna get into that. And I also know, as you kind of explain that, one of the first interactions we had, I learned about your passion for statistics, which was the exact opposite passion I had, and it even gives me PTSD to think about going through my statistics course. when I was in school a few years ago. And so I know that's kind of a passion, or was a passion of yours, which clearly relates to what you're doing now. But how would you explain user experience for people that have no idea what that is?
Yeah, so think about anything that you do really in your daily life where you're interacting with a service, a business, whatever. It could be walking into Starbucks. Um, Please don't sue me for saying this, I guess. But literally walking into a restaurant. Your user experience starts when you pull onto their property. How easy is it to find parking? How close to the door is it? How far is the walk to the door? Once you open the door, is it a push or a pull? How heavy is the door? All of that is part of the user experience in real life. In addition to things that people might think more user experience, like those surveys that you mentioned. But there's actually two different types of research, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more later. Quantitative, which is the more stat stuff that, yes, I am still deeply passionate about, and my coworkers have learned not to ping me at the end of the day with an easy stats question because they know I will get on a soapbox and give them a whole TED talk on it.
Right.
And more qualitative research, which is something along the lines of like interviews, usability studies, where you're not necessarily having as large of a data set, but you're getting kind of these richer sources of data and deeper into that because you get to talk to people.
Right. Well, that's what I'm excited about. We've talked several times about these issues, but to share with listeners is how this concept of asking questions in some capacity, whether it's in a survey format or in person or face to face, or all the different ways, and we can talk about those kind of methods. But if I'm conducting an investigation, I'm trying to get to the bottom line of truthful information, what actually happened. Maybe I'm conducting an interview with a victim or a witness to something, and I want to create an opportunity where they tell me what happened, or a job interview, and I want to try to predict how is this person going to perform as an employee, or maybe an exit interview, and I want to try to figure out what happened when they were here, what can we do to improve the morale of the company. But I think everything that we're going to talk about when in your current space is you're applying it to the user experience in this kind of digital format, but this same thing can apply to anybody that wants to just understand what somebody else is feeling. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, for sure. So you asked what user experience was, and I kind of dropped off at the research part. So user experience research is that research part of it. So in all of those different situations that you outlined. And when it comes to kind of asking the questions, and forgive me because I am very passionate about this and still very nerdy about stats, but kind of boils down to there's an entire field called psychometrics, which is all about the way that we ask questions and measure behavior. So one thing that I really want to highlight that you said is when you're doing an investigation, you want to get to the truth of what happened, which isn't necessarily the case with all forms of interrogation
Right.
or interviewing. But when you want to get kind of to that true measure, which we would say in science speak, the valid measure, you're actually measuring what you want to measure. You need to consider the construct validity of the questions and response options that you're providing. So we can break that down into two pieces if you want. We can start with the kinds of questions that you're asking.
Yeah, I think that's good. And that's what I'm excited as we're going through these. I know we've got several different examples, but I feel like interviewers, when I say interviewer, that could be a parent talking to their child, right? It could be
Yeah.
a job interview, but as the question asker, we're always so focused on what did the other person say, and sometimes don't realize the way we presented that question is contaminating what they're about to say or guiding what they're about to say. And one of the
Exactly.
first kind of types of questions, or maybe inappropriate questions or issues, is this way that we maybe contaminate somebody's memory or response. And I know you can speak to the research on this, but if, for example, I asked you, maybe I'm a patrol officer and I showed up to respond to a car accident, and you were a a witness, right? You're sitting at the red light and you saw these two cars do something, right? Which is what we'll talk about. These two cars collide, contact, crash, hit each other, whatever it might be. And I ask you a question like, well, how fast was that car going when it hit the other car? How fast were those cars going when they crashed into each other? Give me some more information about what is wrong with that question, or what issues could arise from a question like that.
Yeah, so for that, you kind of have to break down a couple of different things. So when I say construct validity, that's any abstract thing, really, that we want to measure in a concrete way. So an abstract concept like speed, right? So because of the technology in cars, we know the speed of the car because they can like plug their little thing in and get
Right.
it. If it's one of the cars that has those. But exactly as you said, the words that you choose matter both for people's response to your question as well as then how they in the future remember that. So Liz Loftus has done some great research on this, and going back to the 70s actually, and asked that exact same question: how fast were the cars going when they smashed, collided, bumped, hit, or contacted each other? And depending on the word that was inserted into that sentence, we got varying speeds. So smashed was the highest, contacted was the lowest, right? So if you want to kind of get to the truth of the matter, you might not even want to ask how fast, because that's assuming that speed was involved. You could ask, what speed were the cars going, right? Because fast also has that connotation of extra speed. So when it affects the responses in that way, which is a response bias, and then it also affected how people remembered the incident after the fact, as a more or less serious accident. So in other words, the way you phrase a question can actually influences people's memory of their experiences, and this effect is persistent over time, which is really scary when you think about implications. You gave a law enforcement example, but in law enforcement, if that eyewitness is called later to testify, because that's going to be a prolonged effect.
So now that's a good point. So now later they get called to testify, or they have a follow-up interview with a detective because maybe it's a more serious investigation, or the insurance company contacts them, 3 weeks later, and they recall the event as being, man, those cars were really going fast and they smashed into each other. That may not be an accurate recall of the incident, but based more so off the way the question was phrased.
Yeah, so really long standing and far reaching consequences of question phrasing. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, I think it's a good area to expand on, because I'm thinking about a lot of the folks we have in the human resources or like employee relations, investigative space, or even anybody that's a manager or supervisor, and you've got maybe two employees that got into an argument, and oftentimes there's a report filed about like workplace violence or threat or an argument, and all of those terms are so subjective. And so if I'm following up and I say, hey, Emily, can you talk to those two managers and figure out what happened? And you ask the question like, well, how hard did Dave hit that guy? Or how violent was the threat? But the words like violence and threat are now going to contaminate the memory in the same way. So I think that's really good feedback, is be aware of those subjective terms that we're suggesting to the person we're asking a question to.
And just to kind of expand on that example a little bit more, I wouldn't even start with following up with, tell me X specific details. I would start much more open and asking them to describe the incident again, so that way you are not contaminating them. Just
Right.
tell me what happened.
I think that is and we talk about this a lot in our training, one of the simplest takeaways for people to have from the training, but one of the most difficult things for people to incorporate, because we're so focused, especially in an investigative space, you feel like you know what happened. People don't think in the moment. Or even if I just ask, hey, tell me about the fight you saw yesterday, or tell me about the car accident you saw yesterday. Even car accident, even fight might be suggesting what happened. So if we can try to be more, as much open-ended and withholding detail as possible, tell me about anything you might have observed yesterday, and allow them to use, well, I saw these two cars and they just smashed into each other. Well, tell me more about that. Or what do you mean by smashed, right? And allow the witness, because I'm wondering, and maybe you can expand on this, how much do the terminology usage also impact what the investigator gets? Like, what do they remember from that information too? Does it change their perspective?
Yeah, so it definitely does because then they're provided with additional details that may not be valid. And kind of putting it in a different frame, if you want to talk about kind of more user experience type of stuff, if you ask a question like, how much did our new feature improve your experiences with our product? Right? You're asking about improvement. You are assuming that there was an improvement.
Right.
And you are biasing potential responses in that way. As a result, you're going to wind up with a positive skew suggesting that your new product or the new feature improved experiences when if you had asked it a different way, just like, give me a second to think and maybe edit out the blank.
What you're saying though, I like, because as you're going, I'm thinking about. I just traveled the last like 3 weeks straight, so I've got surveys from certain rental car companies, hotels, an Airbnb review, and every one of those feels like the survey is guiding me towards a positive response. And so I'm sure there's a difference between, is somebody asking a question because they actually want feedback so they can improve a potential process, or do they just want marketing data to say 4 out of 5 doctors recommend, right? And that, I think that's the difference that you're kind of referring to there. But I feel that as the user all the time.
I think Uber actually, because I was also traveling quite a bit the past couple weeks, I think they phrased their question, how was your trip with driver?
Right.
And that is a kind of following up on my example. How was your experience with our new feature?
Right.
Or how was your experience with our product? And if you ask that question before and then after you introduce the new feature, you can compare those numbers.
Yeah.
And if the new feature is the only thing that changed, you can make some assumptions, limited and
Right.
scoped, that the new feature may have done that or contributed to that change in
I
score.
think that's really good takeaway, because I'm also reflecting on exit interviews that managers may have with somebody who's leaving a business, or a job interview, or really any experience. And a lot of times we're leading, I feel like, in those questions. We're assuming it was either a negative experience or positive, and we're trying to expand on that versus just letting somebody share it more independently. And that's as I kind of think about the job interview concept. I know we've talked, and you gave me some examples of these like predicting type questions, or the what if, what would you do if questions. And I'll just throw an example out there, and then I'll let you kind of expand on this. But I just instructed a program for on de-escalation. So it was with some organized crime investigators and people that interact in some confrontational situations. And we were talking about, how do you use some of the rapport-based research to react more adaptively and more positively in a emotional situation. But in the training, when I ask, so what would you do in this situation? It's easy for people on a webinar or in an in-person class to say, I would handle it perfectly. Here's exactly what I would say. But then when you think about like what would actually happen in the moment, when adrenaline is high, when emotions are high, and we actually have to make an impulsive decision, how would they act? So these questions I know come up all the time in a job interview, right? Tell me, how would you handle a situation where, insert example? What's the validity of those questions, or are there issues with those questions?
So there are issues with those questions because humans are notoriously bad both at predicting their own future behavior, and even worse at predicting the future behavior of others. But also, we're pretty bad at remembering kind of mundane things. Like, what did you have for breakfast on 2 weeks ago.
Right.
Friday,
No
2 weeks
idea.
ago.
Coffee. I know I had coffee, and it was probably black coffee, straight diesel, right to the heart. Yeah,
Right. But is that because you have black coffee every day?
probably. Right. Maybe that
Were
was a
you
lot.
traveling?
That could have been a special latte morning, but I'm thinking, what
Mhm.
is my typical morning versus what might that morning have been?
Exactly. And like you said, with predicting future behavior, it's very easy to predict or say things when you are divorced from that situation. And there are none of those external inputs coming at you that your brain is having to process. You can prepare as much as possible, but I think the purpose, to your point, with interviews, how would you handle a situation if? A lot of those interview questions, the hypotheticals that are asked in like interviewing for a job, the purpose of those is more to see the caliber of character than to actually serve as a prediction of that future behavior. So those are typically part of like behavioral portions of interviews where they want to see, they're more interested in your thought process than they are with what you would actually do, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
They're,
that's
they're hoping that you would do that if you answer well, but
right. That's a good way to look at it. And hopefully people are listening if they're hiring managers, they're thinking about it that way. Because so you're not, if you're asking to tell me about a time that you did do something, right? So past experience, you can actually maybe see how did they handle a situation. They're probably fabricating half of their answer, but they're giving you something. But if it's a more predictive, how would you handle it? It's more about how are they taking a second to think about the steps and the thought process on how they would make that decision versus what's the final decision actually being made. I think that's fair. That's good. Now,
it's,
there's also a lot of confusing questions that people ask,
mhm.
and sometimes I deal with this like hosting these calls because I have guests like you that have so much information. So in my head, I'm like, I want to ask her 42 different things at the same time. And if it all comes out at once, now you're going to be confused as to which one should you answer. Maybe you only answer one, and you can't keep track of all the other questions. And even me, who I'm doing interviews all the time, we train interviewing. I fall into that habit. But when we talk about confusing questions, compound questions, is that something that from in your space you spend a lot of time on, kind of dissecting what a question looks like and how clear or confusing the perception may be?
That really is. Before we get into that, though, I do want to say that it's not that you should never ask hypothetical questions. It's just that when you do ask them, that you make sure that you're appropriately qualifying the
Right.
results.
Yeah. Be aware of what you're measuring from that.
Yeah.
Right.
But to the confusing and complicated questions, asking several simpler questions provides you with clearer insights than when you try to ask, like you said, everything everywhere all at once. So, to give kind of a more HR example, if I asked you, how much do you agree that working from the office leads to increased productivity compared to fully remote or hybrid work options?
Right.
Right, and that was just verbal. I would need to read that question to even have a handle on the start of that.
Yeah.
But because I have it written down in front of me, like, what am I asking about there? Am I asking about agreement with the statement overall? Am I asking if working from the office increases productivity in general, or if productivity in the office is greater than fully remote, or hybrid, or both? So when you can break it down into those different aspects, it really depends on what's the goal of this.
Right.
What am I trying to get at? And really kind of sitting down and defining those abstract concepts before you even start writing the question, and really getting a grasp on what is the true research question here. And just to take it a step further, sometimes these questions that you want answered, you're not coming up with them on your own. Sometimes you're dealing with stakeholders, or bosses, or skip managers, or coming all the way hand to God down that we want to know the answer to this question. It's your job to kind of parse out that information of, one, what are they really asking about? And two, how am I going to get the information that's going to help them respond in the way that they want? And a lot of that goes to whether you're making the questions or not. Those are questions that you should ask yourself. And then having those conversations to get people on board with the way that you're asking that. And having someone you can bounce those ideas off of, kind of just like on your same level, is helpful. Especially if you're not necessarily practiced with having those what can be contentious conversations of, no, we want to ask this way, but are you going to get the answer that you want if we ask it that way?
Yeah, it's a good point. Practice the questions, because the other, as you're going through that, and the hypothetical question that you asked was about hybrid work policy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Working from home. And so I'm thinking, because this is another, and I know we could talk forever about this topic, another issue that interviewers have is, and not just interviewers, lay people focus too much on the physical behavior of a respondent that we know is not a good qualifier of like truth or deception. But if we put that into context, right? If you asked me as maybe one of your employees and you are trying to decide, do we have a new work from home policy or not, right? And you ask me this kind of confusing, wordy question. As you ask the question, I might hesitate. I might give you like a confused look, but you may perceive that as, I disagree with having to come back into the office. I don't like the work from home, policy that we currently have, and I want to stay at home. But maybe my physical response is because I don't understand your damn question. I'm confused about what you just meant. So I don't know if that, clearly in the digital space, might be a little bit different, but I'll give you the opportunity, because I know you're passionate about it, but misreading the physical response from somebody, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I just realized as you're saying that I've for a lot of this, I've been sitting with kind of my arms in front of me crossed like this, which would be closed behavior. I mean, I'm
Right.
sitting forward, so I'm engaged, but closed behavior because my arms are crossed. It's not because I'm nervous. It's not a comfort mechanism. It's simply because I need help sitting up straight. I had a lot of physical activity yesterday, and my back is sore.
Right.
So this is just to keep me sitting upright.
Right. Doesn't mean, so you're not mad at me is what you're saying.
I am not mad at you.
Good.
But yeah, so there are a lot of different ways that our own perceptions, cultural, experiential, lived experience, can influence the way that we view behavior in others. So, for instance, I'm biracial, Arab white, and there is different body language that has been introduced from those two sides of the family, where something in one culture is offensive in the other, something in the other, and vice versa. But it affects the way I move my body when I talk. It affects the way that I talk in general, how loud I speak, and in what environment. So there's just a lot about both verbal and nonverbal, but specifically nonverbal behavior, where there really is just no scientific support about watching someone's physical behavior and trying to deduce anything from that.
Right. Other than maybe somebody, for some reason, has anxiety or concern or something, but we have no idea what that, it could be because something else is going on in their head about a completely unrelated topic, or like you mentioned, the arms crossed. Maybe all of a sudden your air conditioning kicked on and you're cold and you crossed your arms, right? Completely irrelevant to the topic. But I wanted to mention that because when you talk about confusing questions, I've seen that a lot as we're watching interrogation footage, is an investigator or detective just asks a long-winded question and the response from the subject is almost, it looks like confusion. And I think the interpretation is guilty, right? They pause too much. They're thinking about something. And so I think that was a good takeaway. The flip of this, right, when you talk about confusing questions, so then the alternative is direct closed-ended questions, which I know there's pros and cons to that. So I'll let you kind of expand on that, and then I'll give an example of something that we've seen in the class. But what do we mean by closed-ended questions?
Yeah, so just like having biased questions elicits biased responses, having biased response options can do that as well. Before we jump into the difference between closed and open-ended questions, can you ask me an either-or question?
Yes. So let's say let's say we're working on a project together and you didn't fulfill your obligation on that project. So maybe I could ask you an alternative question like, do you just not care and you just didn't want to do that for me? Or did you just simply forget? Is that why it didn't happen? Which one was it?
Yes.
Problem, right?
Right. So, an interesting thing with either or questions, when you phrase them like that and it's an open-ended question, like I can provide you with stuff. So, if yes is an option, yes is technically a valid answer to an either or question without
Right.
disclosing any additional information. It was either one or the other. I don't know which. You don't know which. It's very snarky and sassy, and I might have a little bit of pettiness mixed in there,
Right.
but so even though that was a specific type of closed-ended question where you thought you were going to get me by providing or forcing me to choose between one of those, unless yes is not a response available, yes is a valid answer.
Right.
So let's get into the difference between closed and open-ended questions.
I
Just
think I'm gonna just because that's a really good point you just had. And we still see this with investigators, right? And the
Mhm.
specific example I gave you, did you not fulfill that your obligation because you intended not to, right? You don't care, or did you just simply forget? We see this a lot too in investigations. Like one is almost a worse answer, morally worse maybe than the other.
Mhm.
And the third option that's not being provided is maybe there's a legitimate explanation why you couldn't get that project done.
Right.
So we see that in the investigative space a lot. Is not only does it do what you just said, but sometimes incentivizes people just to comply with the lesser of two evils.
Exactly. And depending on the way that it's presented, and whatever framing has been done in advance, the rapport that you have with that person, they may not feel comfortable to offer their true response to that. They may feel enticed to choose the lesser of two evils. And in that case, like in the investigative space, you can wind up with that leading to false confessions or false
Right.
plea bargains.
Right.
So, again, one of those things where, depending on the space in which these questions are being asked, there are serious consequences
Yeah.
to not making sure that your question craft is where it should be.
Right. No, that's perfect. So then, sorry, I cut you off. We were going from there to other types of closed-ended specific questions. I'm going to give you an example, and then maybe you can kind of expand on what the research or what you would teach from this point. But in our training class, one of the activities that sometimes we do is we tell people we have them pair up, and so you and I are in a pair, and maybe you're the subject and I'm the interviewer. And my task is to ask you all about a recent vacation that you went on. And we give somebody like 3 or 4 minutes, ask whatever you want, however you want. Just your goal is to get information. And almost always the first question is, where did you go? And so then you'll respond with whatever, Miami. And then the follow up question is almost always like, how did you get there? Who were you with? Where did you stay? And the kind of takeaway for a few minutes of this interview is people are asking, and this is completely anecdotal, but I would say 90% of their questions are closed ended.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a benefit to some of that, but there's also a huge disadvantage to doing it that way. So I'll kind of set it up that way and let you expand on what are the pros and the cons of asking closed-ended questions like that.
Yeah, so I want to reel it back a little bit to kind of the super nerdy distinction here of closed versus open-ended questions. So
Okay.
closed-ended questions are something where there's like a short response. In a lot of times we see this as a forced choice response. So this is either yes or no, multiple choice, select all, versus providing space to type in or speak. So we see, even though the examples that you provided were more closed-ended in the sense that it's just one or two word answers, right? People are providing them. Technically, they would qualify as open-ended, just denotatively speaking, because they can say whatever they want.
Right.
But they're not encouraging that person to speak more about their experience beyond the question that you just asked. And I think that's kind of the distinction that you guys make between closed and open-ended questions. Is that correct?
Yeah, and maybe closed. That's a good point because I guess closed would be more of did you go on vacation? Yes or no. Did you take a flight? Yes or no.
Right.
Versus what airline did you take, which might be more of a leading question, although technically open because they could I guess, free respond to some aspect. What we see happen to what you were just saying, if somebody asked me, like, where did you go? My last vacation, I would say Maui. But if somebody started with, like, tell me about your last trip, I would explain that I was actually in Oahu for a week training first, and then did this, this, and this, and then flew to Maui for a week. And I'd probably give more, maybe not all the details, but a general like larger landscape for more follow up questions. The way that started,
Exactly. And that's one of the beauties of open-ended questions is that you get richer data. You get people volunteering information that you as the person asking the question, regardless of space, may not have even considered. This could be conversations with like your neighbors. It could be interviews. It could be focus groups. Whatever the case, it increases disclosure. It builds rapport. Kind of think of it as the yes and rule in improv. Yes and it's not bound by any preconceived notions that you have. It's not bound by your own imagination or your knowledge on the topic. And as a result, you can get a lot of information up front and a lot of places where you can probe deeper into. The cons of asking open-ended questions are that sometimes you get really cheeky responses,
right?
like yes, to an either or.
Right. And I think what you just said, allowing people to expand is good. Oftentimes, like when you want to probe for more information, what we see people do all the time, whether they're an experienced interviewer or just a layperson, is they interrupt, right? And you could ask somebody, like, let's say they asked me a good open-ended, tell me about your trip. And as I start to say, well, I went to Oahu, I got to train on Pearl Harbor, and I keep
Tell me
going.
more about that.
Exactly, right? And somebody's like, oh, Pearl Harbor, that's cool. Tell me more about that. And so what has happened is now I'm conditioned, and you can, this is what I'm thinking is happening. You can explain this to me. But what I'm thinking is now I feel like you as the question asker are, that's what you care most about. So I'm going to probably gear more of my response now to Pearl Harbor because that seemed to be what piqued your interest. I've also maybe disrupted my memory recall of everything else I was about to tell you. And then I also have now been conditioned that if I say something, you're going to ask a follow-up question. So maybe I'll stop saying more things, right? And it might actually minimize what I say.
Yeah, so that was a lot all at once.
Right. That's what we call a
And that
confusing,
is it. No, no, no,
complicated
no.
question. Yeah.
I'm gonna try to, keep to it. So the first thing that you mentioned is it'll interrupt your kind of flow, which is really, really important. Because depending on who you're talking to, they may be neurodivergent. Their brains might not be fully formed yet if they're adolescents. And really having that interruption can throw off what they were about to say, and they may not remember it at all. If you're working under limited time, they may have just forgotten what they were going to tell you in advance. So if you want to increase the accessibility of stuff, and this is harder to do in some situations than others, but whenever you ask a question, especially if you've had time to plan it out in advance, and this is more research, less investigation, but also gets into HR spaces, is provide a written form of the question. And that's super easy to do with online interactions. You can just pop it in the chat. If you're interviewing someone for a role, you're doing an exit interview, because that way, if they have it as a reference, it's a nice catch in case your questions aren't clear, or if the person has any other disability that may affect their ability to process the data. So maybe they have a hearing impairment, right? Maybe it's just noisy where they are. So they may not be able to fully understand you. Having that written will provide, that way if they, evade some part of your question, it's purposeful and not because, well, not necessarily purposeful, but evasion of part of your question isn't necessarily indicative that they're hiding something.
Right, and not a result of you interrupting their answer. Because when you said HR, I'm thinking tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker and how you handled it. And you start to answer that question and you say, well, I had this group project and I was working with so and so and I didn't really like him. What do you mean you didn't like him? Right? If I interrupt your response, it's the same thing. I think you're not going to give me a further response, and now it's focused on that one piece of information. Silence is so uncomfortable for people in an interview, but I think it's one of the most powerful tools that we have is just to allow somebody to actually be in the moment, recreate the context, and answer the question.
Yeah. And in that case, too, like depending on the amount of research that you do before interviewing for a position, you may have notes on common hypothetical questions that you can refer to. But it's also okay to ask for a moment of time to think. That may not be received as well in the investigative space, but just taking the time and feeling empowered to ask for that time so that you can collect your thoughts is a great way. And as people who are asking these questions, you should empower the people to whom you're asking to take that time and space as well.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Another type of question, and this is more probably directly related to survey data and this term of a Likert scale, and you can explain that for everybody. But this is more so what I see after an Uber ride or after a hotel stay or whatever, and it's rank this from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or A through F or whatever, and strongly agree to strongly disagree and all these different things in between. So it seems to be the most popular. Maybe it's the easiest way to get quantitative data. I don't know. I'll let you kind of explain on that. But what are some maybe the issues? What do I look at that from a user? Like I'm always nervous which answer. If I answer all 5s, is that giving them too much credit? How are they comparing that to? What does all that look like?
Yeah, so Likert scales are pretty common across different industries, and they're exactly what you said. They're 5, 7 point scale, whatever, with opposite anchors. So strongly disagree to strongly agree, and or whatever those anchors are, strongly negative to strongly positive.
Right.
The nice thing about these is that you get faster analysis from more respondents, and there's consistency in the responses offered because people can only choose from these options available. On the flip side of that, though, you really need to consider the type of response options that you're providing. So, Likert scales look a lot like semantic differential scales or any type of scale where it might not be opposite ends of a spectrum, right? It could. So going back to my example from earlier with the how much did this new feature improve our product, still phrased improperly, but if you could not at all to very much, does that sound like it encaptures everything?
Right. I don't know.
It doesn't, right? Because we're missing that opposite end of the spectrum, which is it actually made my experience worse.
Right. So not at all means it didn't improve, but it still maintained the same.
Exactly.
Right.
So thinking about how you frame your scales, do you have truly opposite ends of the spectrum there? Or are you only measuring one side? And what insights can you get from that? If you have a multiple choice question, you have to make sure that you both capture all possible responses and that none of your response options overlap. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get clear insights from that. Then you have to get into kind of like, if we want to get into a little bit more loaded space with demographics like sex, gender, race, you need to when you're putting those into things, make sure that people are able to select multiple and also provide a comprehensive list. For instance, for me, I am white and Arab. I have not been able to report that my Arab side on the census until the new policy that they just put into effect.
So you're getting your data is going to be wrong or misclassified in some of those because people have to figure out how does my answer somehow, what does my answer most closely fit to versus what isn't
Exactly.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. When you were saying about the improvement, I'm thinking even after a training class, we might ask somebody, right, how much did attending this training class, improve your investigative skills? And that could go from 0 to whatever, but there's no, really not an answer available that it actually made me worse because we're assuming you went to training, you had to have gotten better, but it's the
Yeah.
same concept. We're not really giving potentially every option in that. And I think that's probably consistent for a lot of user experience surveys.
No comment.
Right. Right. But and we kind of started with this, like it's, what is the real, there's probably two issues as do they have somebody like you who can give this kind of feedback and the research behind it and the kind of, is this a research based survey? But then the second issue, because so it might be ignorance to knowing that. The second is what is the purpose of collecting that data? Is it to actually figure out what's going on, or is it to just provide, a positive marketing feedback to someone? And when somebody has a direct benefit to the results of that survey, which I guess you could say with researchers too, right? If a survey is designed just to support the hypothesis, we would have a problem. Same problem.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm gonna translate that to, and as we can kind of hit some of these key takeaways too to
Mhm.
encapsulate all of this, but we were just talking a little about research and kind of collecting data, survey data, marketing data maybe, but I think that same malicious intent could be in a coercive interrogation, coercive interview, where in the moment maybe an investigator has confirmation bias, tunnel vision, and so we were kind of softly talking about maybe somebody is creating surveys so they get really positive marketing data. They want the result of that survey to support their brand. I would think, and you can correct me on this or expand on it, if I have this theory that John Doe committed the crime and I don't want to listen to anything other than that, I wonder, is it possible that because I have that presumption of guilt, that my questions are being phrased and structured in a way just to support my pre-existing theory?
100%, and there is tons of data on this topic. So you are more likely to ask guilt presumptive questions in the first place. You're more likely to pick up and remember guilty things that sound guilty, pick up as in interpret ambiguous information in a way that you perceive as guilty, kind of what we were talking about earlier. And it affects your whole lens through which you approach the investigation. And you ignore information that comes up in the interview that could be exculpatory.
Yes, and unfortunately, I think we see that all the time, and I think it is a blend, maybe malicious sometimes, but I honestly think it's more, and maybe I don't know what the research, and you can obviously educate myself and listeners on this, but I would imagine a lot of it comes down to this confirmation bias, tunnel vision, maybe even in good faith, we'll just say, I received evidence from somebody, some expert that says this is your primary suspect. And so there's just natural kind of human element where now I started to ask more leading questions and had a higher presumption of guilt. It's not like I went in there saying, I want to get this person, I know they're innocent, I want to make them confess to something, which I'm sure happens. But I feel like it's more common on the other side of that. Does that make sense, or is that relative?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you were kind of getting into a free will argument, which is, do we have free will, or are we just the sum of all of the sources of input that come at
Right.
us? But yes, every single piece of an investigative process can be biased, including, evaluations of fingerprint matches that APHIS throws at you. You might see some markers. Is it enough? Do you know about the race of the different suspects? Do you have presumptions about, people of that race and how they may or may not be more likely to commit certain types of crimes. So every single part of the investigative process, as you mentioned, from when you're on the ground, interviewing witnesses right after it happens, to when you get in the interview room, that can all be biased, and the sum of those different decisions and those different sources of bias compound upon each other.
Right. And we get asked this question all the time of, we talk about implicit biases and these biases that exist from, I've got an eyewitness that says it was this person. And so I'm walking in with this preconceived notion the eyewitness is maybe right, not realizing that might be a leading cause of wrongful convictions, and eyewitnesses are terrible often. But we get asked, like, how do you try to mitigate bias in the interview? And we can talk about this forever, but directly related to our topic, I would feel like asking better questions that, from what you just provided, that don't persuade an answer or change somebody's memory. I think even having structured set of questions, or ways we ask the questions, I guess, might be one way to mitigate bias. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah, for sure. And just taking it out of the investigative space, even if you just look back at different conversations in different scenarios, I've done research on whether the setting and the power dynamics affect perceptions of truthfulness, just by changing a single word in a sentence. I promise, I swear, I did not do. And the settings and the power dynamics on those that one word, changed people's perceptions of whether or not this person was just like walking in to get coffee, saw a purse on the table, or if they actively took a wallet out of it.
So you're saying the subject's response to the question using that word, or something, and the interviewer's questioning, or either way?
I had it both if the interviewer asked them directly, or the suspect, for lack of a better word, volunteered that statement. But one of them was like an HR, like a boss asking the employee what had happened. And it was just like so crazy to me to see how just changing one word affected so much.
Yeah. So to fix that, or to address that, interviewers should do what? What should interviewers be aware of to avoid, or maybe use that if it's a beneficial tool?
Well, I would say that exploiting cognitive and psychological behavior is a little bit of a moral maybe not do that.
Right.
But just from a purely question and answer based standpoint, which is the topic of this talk, is it really takes practice, especially if you're in a situation where you need to come up with questions on the fly. But using neutral and unbiased language during your inquiries for both questions, and if you're providing possible responses, whether this is in an investigative role, in an interviewing, like HR type thing, or even if you're doing research. But knowing and acknowledging your own biases is a great start. There are resources online where you can test for some of these implicit biases, which is good to be aware of. But having a second set of eyes when you're planning stuff can also help catch any slip-ups.
Yeah, that was a great, perfect response, because when I was asking that question, I was thinking even interviewers that might talk to a victim or a survivor of a very traumatic incident, is sometimes there's, I think, a bias on the complete other side, as we want to be so supportive and so thoughtful and empathetic, that sometimes it's using words to almost affirm their experience without being independent and just asking open-ended questions. So I think it can work, it can bias on both sides of those types of investigations.
It really can, and empathy is human nature, so it can be very difficult to, take a step back.
Yeah, Well, so much good information in all of this, and takeaways. not just again for an investigator, for somebody doing a job interview, an exit interview, somebody even just talking to their significant other, right? If I asked you, what do you want to do for dinner tonight? Do you want to go to Italian or Mexican? It's a choice question. I'm not really giving you the opportunity to say you'd rather just stay home and order pizza or whatever. And so I think there's just so much here of how can we be better active listeners in the form of how are we asking questions to have that conversation. So really good takeaways. I want to kind of leave it with you if you've got maybe one thing or one area that if people have all this information and thinking, how do I take this away? What do I do next? Like what's one of those big takeaways you want people to get from the time we just spent together?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, not just from this, but from my experience as a whole, is that your focus, both on making sure that you have the right questions, is that you create an environment where people are able to feel comfortable providing honest feedback to you. Whether this is offering a way for truly anonymous feedback where you're not linking stuff back to people's IDs in any way, or asking questions, you might have an anonymous form, but you ask questions that are demographics, and there's so few people with certain demographics that you can pinpoint it. And really focusing on building rapport kind of at the beginning, whether that's trust with a customer, whether it's in a discussion. We took a few minutes to chat before we actually started recording. But making sure that people are able to and feel comfortable giving you their true experiences.
Yeah, that's a great close to this, because you can ask the best question, but if somebody's not in a situation where they're comfortable answering it, it doesn't really matter. So I think that's really good. Well, I appreciate all your takeaways and your time today, and always. We'll make sure for those listening or watching that we'll link Emily's LinkedIn account. I know you're active on there. Is a good way to kind of stay in touch and connect. And a lot of the research we talked about, we'll add some of those in the show notes too, so if people want to look into that themselves and learn some more. And I know you mentioned the implicit bias, some of the testing that's available for people to kind of go look at and take. We can list some of that in the show notes as well. So thank you all for listening. And Emily, thank you so much for your time as always.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Great. Thanks for listening to this episode of Truth Be Told. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. And to keep this conversation going, follow the Truth Be Told podcast on LinkedIn and Truth Be Told CFI on Twitter. On behalf of the International Association of Interviewers, Rick Lander-Zalowski, and our valued sponsors, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Truth Be Told podcast.